one time on a Friday night. I'd gone home, packed my bag, came downstairs, and my mum and dad went, "Where are you going?" I went, "Oh, I'm going around to friends to do my maths homework." And they laughed at me, Ludo. They laughed at me and said, "Oh, okay, of course you are. Like, here's some money for a taxi if you need it. Remember to call us, like whatever." I was like, "No, genuinely going around a friend's house to do our maths homework." They okay. I was like, "Look in my bag. It's literally maths textbooks." I still think they think I was lying, Ludo. I wasn't.
Little shoulder of vodka in the bag.
No, yeah. There was a calculator. As a teacher, I think there's always pressure on you to fill the silence, especially as a trained teacher. We don't like silences. And as a tutor, I think there's a big pressure to not have silences. A parent or whoever is paying you to do some teaching. Oh, I better be teaching. And if I'm not talking, I'm not teaching. Whereas what the science really tells us is our brain needs time to process things. So I wanted to do a podcast because I like podcasts. And we very quickly realized that it was basically the best CPD we were having. And that's the absolute core of an educational podcast. But what it does that maybe formalized CPD sessions can't, because we know those, what books can't, is it brings you into a conversation. And hopefully people who listen to our respective podcasts, like, they don't just feel like they are listening to us talking, they're part of that conversation. And that's a really powerful thing.
Hello and welcome to the Qualified Tutor Podcast, the podcast that brings you the latest in the world of tutoring, edtech and education, and hopefully inspires in you the big change that each and every one of us is capable of. Qualified Tutor is an industry-leading tutor training organisation and online tutoring community for thousands of tutors around the world. This podcast is the voice of this community, where we aim to hear from tutors, teachers, entrepreneurs, coaches, business experts, students, tutorpreneurs, and more from the world of tutoring about what inspires them every day, how they can help tutors like you, and what they've learnt about tutoring along the way. The question is, what will you learn today? Hello and welcome to the 133rd episode of the Qualified Tutor Podcast. My name is Ludo Miller, the host of this podcast. Welcome back to regular listeners. Welcome to any of you for whom this is your first time listening to the Qualified Tutor Podcast. And a very warm welcome to today's guest, Arthur Moore. Arthur, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ludo. It was always my dream to be on the 133rd episode. I was offered to come on the 132nd, wasn't interested. It was all about this one.
And we couldn't wait another week. So this is, as we were just talking about before, Arthur normally sits on my side of the podcasting space as host of his own podcast, which we will definitely be getting into a little bit later on. But today he sits on the guest side. So I wonder if I will be the recipient of any questions today. If you notice a sort of co-hosting, no guest format today, listeners, then that'll be why. But I'm sure many of you will have heard of Arthur through his work, both as a private tutor and as a co-host of the Tea and Teaching podcast, along with Mike Harrowell. But for those of you who haven't come across Arthur, he is graduated with an MA in education, taught as a secondary maths tutor for a number of years, having joined the Teach First program in 2014, and then ventured over to Southeast Asia, to Thailand, and taught in Thailand for several years before coming back to the UK just before lockdown. He then became head of year in a school in 2019 and turned to tutoring that year, and as I just mentioned, has since launched the Tea and Teaching podcast to help understand the teaching and tutoring spaces a little bit more, along with his co-host Mike Harrowell. So Arthur, thank you very much for joining us today. What is giving you reason to smile today, Arthur?
What a lovely question. Thanks for having me, Ludo. So, what's given me reason to smile today is, I started the conversation the day with a chat with a fellow tutor, Charlotte Watson, and then I'm getting to continue the chat about tutoring and education with yourself. So, what's putting a smile on my face is I like talking about education. You've given me a chance to talk about education, so I'm happy.
So you're grabbing it with both hands. Well, the link to the Tea and Teaching podcast will be in the show notes below. So listeners, at the end of this podcast, that is really your next step, is to go and check out all the times that Arthur and Mike have talked about education. But as regular listeners will know, we like to start this podcast with a segment that takes our guest and our listeners back to the beginning. So Arthur, I gather with a bit of rummaging and a bit of discussion with your partner, you were able to recall a few tales and learnings from your school days. Is that right?
Yeah, so what was interesting, when you mentioned we were going to do this, Ludo, I had to do my reflective time of going for a walk or for a run and think about it. So I think my education was very kind of generic. I went to a very generic primary school, the one down the road where a bunch of us would meet up and walk down to our primary school. My teachers would probably have described me, and I'm sure they did, as a good kid. I did not like being told off, Ludo. So I did as I was told. I wouldn't describe myself as one of the cool kids. I was very happy kind of when it was maths class. That was kind of student I was. I then again went to a very standard state comp for my secondary school. My partner would have described, she went to a different secondary school nearby. She would describe that secondary school as rough. I would describe it as quite nice compared to the other options. So it was, again, one of those classic secondary schools where if you're in it, it was fine. But other people probably looked at it and went, oh, that's a bit of a rough school. It was not a rough school. When Amy Cutmore listens to this. Again, my teachers would describe me as like probably a goody two shoes, didn't like getting told off, did as he was told, sat in the front of the room, listening to class. Again, it was all about maths and drama for me, Ludo. They were my two kind of things that I wanted to do. They were kind of my passions at school. Like, looking back on that school, like, my problem was, like, I found it really easy, and it wasn't easy. So maybe I was just being really lazy, but I kind of just did what I had to do, especially in maths, like sitting at the back of a room by myself with a textbook because I had to teach myself the course because the other kids were probably misbehaving and I was a bit of a bod, I would have been called at school. Just wanted to get on. So after my GCSE results, this is my first favourite story. So I'm a mathematician, Ludo. That's what I like to do. But I did do German at GCSE. Languages aren't my forte, and I probably, again, didn't put the effort in I should have. I managed to get a B, and I went in to get my results, and I opened up, got a B, and I was very happy with this, like very happy to even have passed. And the head of languages came up to me. She looked me in the eye, and she went, Arthur, you've got a B. I just wanted to say, and I mean this, Arthur, that is a disgrace to the subject and the language I love. And the fact you've got an A, I feel a B, sorry. I feel ashamed. I'm happy for you, but I'm ashamed of my subject that they have recognised your ability in German with a B. And that's always stuck with me. To succeed and to be told by a teacher that my succeeding was not welcomed by her as a teacher. So that was good. I then moved to a different school for sixth form, which is where I met my partner, in the lovely school, because it wasn't as rough as Roding Valley. And again, Ludo, this is because I came from the not rough school. My other subject was history that I loved. And again, I remember this is the first lesson of the year 12, with a new school, excited. Now, all the kids from my school were made to stand up, and we came to the front of the room on our history lesson by our teacher, who I will not name. And he told us in front of the whole class that because we were from the school I went to, we were already behind all his fantastic kids, and we were already behind, and we were not very good at history. He then asked us to tell the rest of the class our grades in front of the whole class, and wasn't very happy when it went A star, A star, A star, B. But I never forgot that, of being humiliated in front of the whole class because of the teacher's perception of me before I had even done anything. 6 months down the line, that would have been fine. But no, he had already made his judgment upon me as a student based on what he had seen on his piece of paper on his desk. And that annoyed me. And it still annoys me now. I'm getting annoyed talking about it. At that school, I was one of the kids that did further maths. So we did maths and further maths. So we basically became a world unto ourselves, Ludo. So we did maths. We stayed in maths to do further maths. We then went to the library to do the maths homework. I remember one time on a Friday night, I'd gone home, packed my bag, came downstairs, and my mum and dad went, "Where are you going?" I went, "Oh, I'm going around to friends to do my maths homework." And they laughed at me, Ludo. They laughed at me and said, "Oh, okay, of course you are. Like, here's some money for a taxi if you need it. Remember to call us, like whatever." I was like, "No, genuinely going around a friend's house to do our maths homework." They're like, "Okay, sure you are. Like, just make sure you call us tomorrow when you come back." I was like, "Look in my bag. It's literally maths textbooks." And I still think they think I was lying, Ludo. I wasn't.
A little shoulder of vodka in the bag.
No, yeah. There was a calculator. So that's my school in a nutshell, which is basically I liked maths, so I did lots of maths. And the other kids probably judged me because I was one of the people who did maths.
Yeah. The number of times that a guest on this podcast, tells us that they were a bit of a nerd, bit of someone that would traditionally have liked to do the homework and finished it early and given it back to the teacher and asked for more. And B, the number of guests who say there was this one teacher who either had a really positive or negative impact. It's amazing the number of times that a teacher has influenced the way that we think, a particular teacher. And there is a responsibility to that, isn't there? When we later go on to become educators ourselves, there's an understanding there that we do hold an important place in the minds of our students, and we can't forget that. And it shouldn't burden us, but it shouldn't be something we forget either. And I love the way that initial question brings out a little bit about why our guest has gone on to become what they've become.
Yeah, I think I should also add there, Ludo. There was also a teacher. So when I went to this school that I suppose, starting to rebel against, and not rebelling in a typical sense of going out drinking or anything, like rebelling by kind of being a bit arrogant, an arrogant 17-year-old who would have heard of it. And in one of my first further maths classes, the teacher called me out on being a bit too arrogant. But she did it in a completely different way to the other teacher did. She did it in private. And she spoke honestly to me, and it was after she got to know me for a bit. And she was the best teacher I've ever had. And I will name her Miss Gregsby because she was phenomenal. So when I look back on teaching, like two teachers who called me out maybe on something, but one did it in such a way that they inspired me to go and be better. She was awesome. And one person who'd done it because he had made a judgment on me, not based on what he thought of me rather than what I'd actually done.
What an amazing comparison there between those two types and those two reflections on how to approach a situation, Arthur. Thank you. Now, do you think the loving school, the goody two shoes part, the coupled with the injustice that you felt was meted out to you by some teachers, do you think that led you on to become an educator? Do you think that was written in the stone? I mean, what is your why as an educator?
So really, really not. My mum was a primary teacher, and I was told pretty clearly to never be a teacher. And I never wanted to be a teacher. I went to uni and did my undergrad was in management and strategy with integrated placement year. Catchy title, I know. And during that, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And during that school, I went and worked for a year for Microsoft as part of the integrated placement year. And for about a month, I was like, this is brilliant, working in a big company. Isn't this exciting? And then I realized I didn't really like it at all. It just didn't sit with who I was as a person. So I knew fairly quickly on that I didn't want to go down kind of that world of kind of corporate stooge maybe, and I'm sure there's corporate stooges listening to this podcast, and no offense, but that world wasn't for me. So I then went back and finished my degree, and I basically had no idea what I wanted to do. And my partner, who I was living with at the time, was trained to be a teacher. And I think I just went, fine, I'll do that. And I went to Teach First because Teach First got you in the classroom nice and quickly. And that's how I kind of fell into education. So that's kind of like, rather than, you're not going to get a story from me as like, I used to sit around with my toys as a 5-year-old and take the register. No, that's not me. I became an educator because basically I didn't know what else I wanted to do. And I'm very grateful for that lack of drive.
Well, it keeps it nice and open and, flexible and also kind of allows you to keep reflecting on that and working out whether that is still the right thing for you. I mean, you went through the Teach First program, you became a teacher, you left to teach abroad and returned, you're now a tutor. There's it's not like you become an educator and that is one role, and then if you don't want that, then you have to go and become something else. So it's fascinating to see those journeys, and now your journey has taken you to a new part of the education world, which is what we might call kind of edu media, edu Twitter, edu podcasting, that kind of thing. I think it's obviously a key part of what you do today. It's a great way for you to spread your own name and your own work, as well as to give people that wonderful kind of a value add every single day. So we wanted to talk a little bit about this, Arthur, you and I, and I'm going to open this question up to you because you are the knowledgeable one and also my guest today. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you got into the world of podcasting and edu media? And then we'll talk a little bit about the value of that and the power of that.
So I think my story is a really typical one from the edu podcasters I talk to. There was a time where me and my co-host Mike Harwell were living in different countries, but we wanted to keep having our conversations that we used to have about education, that we used to have in the staff room, over cups of tea, maybe on a run, something like that. We always used to have those conversations. And we kind of said, let's have a chat about teaching, and we'll put it out as a podcast. And we did that because we're both kind of podcast nerd. I'm a massive podcast nerd. Like, I listen to a silly amount of podcasts, ranging like from anything. I will listen to it. My partner is always chastising me for saying a sentence that begins with, "Oh, I was listening to a podcast the other day." So I wanted to do a podcast because I like podcasts, and we very quickly realised that it was basically the best CPD we were having. And what we were doing is just talking about teaching with a focus was allowed us to re-explore these areas. And then we started getting guests on the pod. And then we realized, like, this is phenomenal. We're starting to talk to people who know so much about education and what they do, and we get to learn from them. And the only price of that is we have to share that conversation with others. And we always say on the pod, like, we are just doing the pod basically for our own CPD. And then hopefully we can share those conversations and other people getting stuff out. I don't know if that's the same for you. Like, if you started the pod because you wanted to do it, you didn't do it because you're like, oh, I hope it like kind of spreads my name out there.
Yeah, it's kind of like that's a bonus, isn't it? Is how far it spreads. But the truth is, the listener size and how many downloads you're getting a month is not as important as the value that the people who are listening are getting. And I think that's what your podcast very much does. Is every single episode brings in someone who knows a great deal about education, or if it's just the two of you talking, then it's just two experienced educators talking about what they know. I mean, we've talked before about that ongoing CPD element of it. Do you have any kind of clear examples of where that ongoing CPD element has really been kind of the most, the most brought to focus? I mean, where you really felt that like that is a little nugget of information from your podcast that listeners have just learned.
So the ones that really stand out for me are normally based around cognitive science, which is like just such a massively growing topic in the world of education. But was something I'd never be really exposed to when I was training in the early days of my teaching. I only really started thinking about it after 3-4 years in the profession. And I noticed that was having a change upon my teaching in the classroom when I was a classroom teacher. And then as a tutor, I was realizing like I wanted to keep bettering myself as a purely as a teacher, taking out the business side of it that I know listeners think a lot about, taking about like the tech side of it, like how can I teach better? And one of the early episodes that really stood out for me was with Jade Pierce, who is just a phenomenal educator, phenomenal researcher, knows so much. And we just had a generic kind of chat about cognitive science and research-based education. And she really made me realize that I could make small changes to myself as a teacher and how I do things that have a big impact. And then we had her later on to do with questions. So if we do a really specific topic of just like waiting time when asking a question. So as a teacher, I think there's always pressure on you to fill the silence, especially as a trained teacher. We don't like silences. And as a tutor, I think there's a big pressure to not have silences. A parent or whoever is paying you to do some teaching. Oh, I better be teaching. And if I'm not talking, I'm not teaching. Whereas what the science really tells us is our brain needs time to process things. It needs time to reconsider things. And what Jay kind of said to us is like, learning is difficult. And other people have said that on the pod, like Bradley Bush, Ross McGill, these brilliant educators. Like learning is difficult and it takes the brain time to think about these things. And since hearing that really kind of so clearly in a conversation one-to-one with someone, like I've really felt myself as a tutor kind of putting these pauses in and letting the student think. So rather than even jumping in to ask a question, no, let's really wait and give your brain that time to go into its long-term memory, retrieve that information and try and process it before we start trying the question. So that's a really specific thing of like waiting time when asking a question and I can see the benefits it have. I could give you a few ones, but that's the one that straight away stands out for me as something I've directly learned from being involved in a pod.
So how long should I wait after I ask a question on this podcast before interrupting if I don't hear from you?
Well, it depends upon the question you're asking. If you're asking a very factual question, if you're asking for my name, like that's not something that I should have to pause about. But if you're asking me to reflect upon, like you did there, if you're asking me to reflect upon something that means something to me, I need to process that. And there's a reason, isn't there, Ludo, that you sent me some of these questions, the topics we're going to explore beforehand. You did it so I had time to process those thoughts. So your pod doesn't start with, hi, this is Arthur, tell us about your education. I go, give me a moment. We have 2 minutes of science and then I come back. So it's different for each type of question. Are you doing a factual recall question or are you trying to apply that knowledge? But the typical time, and I learned this from Bradley Bush, the typical time a teacher gives a student to answer a question is less time than it takes a Formula One team to change 4 tires on a Formula One car. And that makes no sense. Like we need to give a bit more time. So however much time you're giving, give a little bit more is basically what I took away.
And they change those tires as fast as they can.
Yeah, I'm a big F1 nut, and I hope people appreciate that pun. Big F1 nut, and they do it really fast. Like I can't even think of my name most of the time they change the tires. So we need to give our students a bit longer to process those thoughts. Like learning is difficult, and we as the experts in our subject often forget that our students are novices and they are learning. They are having to recall loads of information. They haven't automated the processes that we have as a maths teacher. Like I need to remind myself that quadratic formula that I was teaching last night, like my student is still substituting those values in. They haven't automated that process. It is going to take them longer to do something that I have automated. If you think about like teaching if you see a learny driver, if you think about when you were learning to drive, the simple things took ages because you are still learning to do them. Like as an experienced driver, I don't think about changing gear, but I really did think about changing gear when I was having my lessons. And we need to remember that with our students.
Absolutely. So, I mean, one of the questions that, one of the issues that we have when thinking about podcasting is that we use the Qualified Tutor podcast as a way to, as you say, to disseminate really useful nuggets of information from the top experts in their field. And I think I've talked about this before. I think the fact that a lot of what our guests say to our listeners is not taking our listeners from point A to some point B that's, a long way in the distance that would require some huge lifestyle change. They are improving our listeners' thinking on a particular subject in such a way that requires small, manageable steps that can be implemented that day or in the next session. And that, as you say, have those big effects in education. The small changes have a big effect in your teaching. That is what I think that the power of podcasts is. But apart from that ongoing CPD element, what else does podcasting have to benefit the education space in whatever way you see that?
So quite often when we our podcast is mainly focused at teachers and schools. I know your podcast is mainly focused at tutors, and the problem will be the same here is we quite often get siloed into the information spheres that we live in. So if I work in a school, the information I get is within that school quite often, unless I go looking elsewhere. So people band around ideas, but those ideas kind of stay in that silo. And it's same with tutors, especially if you're independent tutor like myself. The only ideas sometimes I have to work off are my own. So then I can kind of go down the rabbit hole of my own ideas. And I think what educational podcasts can do is they take you out of your own, you could call it comfort zone, but they take you out of your own kind of sphere of influence and expose you to other ideas. And sometimes it's just that exposure to start with that makes you think, oh, that was interesting. I'll go and look at this. Oh, then I'll look at this. And then you can get more information. But I think that's one of the magics of podcasts is they can be about anything. I'm sure episode 132 was very different to episode 133, which will be very different to episode 134. And that's the magic of your listeners will be getting these little bits of information from outside of their silos that they live in. And who knows where that might lead to. So I think that's the absolute core of an educational podcast. But what it does that maybe formalized CPD sessions can't, because we know what books can't, is it brings you into a conversation. And hopefully people who listen to our respective podcasts, they don't just feel like they are listening to us talking, they're part of that conversation. And that's a really powerful thing to be part of a community. And it's great when you listen to someone on a pod who you really respect, give you a recommendation. You want to go and do that because you listen to their opinion. But also when you listen to someone maybe you don't know, brings a new idea. So it's this brilliant thing of just bringing new people and ideas into your head. Even if you disagree with them, that's getting you thinking.
Yeah.
And just thinking is awesome.
Could be the title of this podcast, maybe. Thinking is awesome. Thinking is awesome with Arthur Moore. Yeah, I mean those are absolutely vital points, and I think added to that is the kind of the logistical part of podcasting, isn't it? Julia Silva, the founder of QT, she tells me she listens to our podcast. I'm not sure if I totally know if she does or not, but when she listens, she says, it's while she's making dinner or washing up or cleaning the house or going for a walk, and you can't do that with necessarily a blog or with a piece of live video content, of which the video is an important part of that. So
they're incredibly accessible and they can fit into your routine rather than your routine having to fit into them. So if you want to do a CPD session, you're like, oh, I have to make time to do that. Whereas the podcast can fit in with your time. So I listen to podcasts when I cook, when I walk, when I drive, all these places. But I don't change what I'm doing because I'm listening to a podcast. I just change the podcast I'm listening to.
Yeah. Now, I realize here that we are two podcasters sitting here talking about how amazing educational podcasts are, and not only that, but the people who are hearing the words that we're saying right now will be people who probably listen to podcasts as well. What can we do? And I mean we as in you and I, but also every single one of you listening in now. If you have ideas on this question, please send them into the SpeakPipe link that's in the bottom. That will be in the show notes of this episode and every episode, in fact. What can we do as those in the education space who either create or listen to podcasts to bring more educators into the space, to help people to find good podcasts?
I think it was interesting you paused before you asked that question so you could give your brain time to think about how you were going to word it. What can we do to kind of spread the word of podcasts, essentially? I think it's as simple as spreading the word. And that means this is not about go and write it on your blog, put it on your LinkedIn, put it on your Twitter. It's about whose opinion, who relies on your opinion. If you share that opinion, who's going to listen? So I recommend podcasts to people who I talk to, who I think that podcast is going to appeal to them. And I think it's about being specific. So if I was going to recommend a podcast to you, Ludo, I wouldn't just recommend a podcast. I would think about like, what are you interested in? What do you want to learn more about? And then maybe I'd recommend a podcast on that. So if you hear someone talking about, I want to hear more about kind of a real deep dive into some of the educational books I've been reading, well, go and listen to Page to Practice, an educational podcast based on kind of educational books. If you want a real deep dive into some pedagogical faults, well, go and listen to Become an Educator by Darren Leslie. If you're really interested in primary education, go and listen to The Dynamic Deputies. But it's recommending podcasts that are based on what people want to listen to. I think there's also things you can do. Like I know schools share newsletters. I know Tea and Teaching has been shared in newsletters in schools and put up on staff notice boards. And it's the same for the tutoring community, isn't it? We've got our virtual staff room. We've got our virtual kind of notice boards. Let's share the stuff we have found beneficial. And then the last thing I'll do is always recommend something you have listened. I've heard it before where people go, oh, listen to this podcast. Which episode? Oh, I don't really know. Like, now be specific. Like, go and listen to something. If you think of something that could be beneficial to someone else, then go and let that person know. It's the same as we recommend Netflix. We recommend movies. We recommend TV shows all the time. We recommend them to different people at different times. Let's do the same podcast. Podcast is just another form of media. So let's treat it as such.
Absolutely. And it shows that you care and you listen about that person's needs as well, doesn't it? And now, a brief word from last week's guest, Ms. Bar Iqbal, whose episode you can check out after this.
Thank you, Ludo, for giving me this amazing opportunity to be on the Qualified Tutor podcast. This podcast helped me reiterate a lot of points that I had said, and probably, when I said those again, it just reminded me of where I have to go and bigger things that I have to achieve. So thank you very much for that. I learned a lot from your vision, your passion of taking Qualified Tutor to every household. And probably this is what resonates with my vision of taking Eximus to every household in the UK too. So thank you for this amazing opportunity. And for the next guest, I would just like to say that every day starts with a new sunlight, a new optimism, a new way. And the reason why you're here in this podcast is because universe paved a way for you to be here. So bigger things to achieve and higher skies to cross.
Arthur, thank you for dissecting and pulling apart and maximizing the understanding of edu podcasting. I think there is a great deal in there for people to work on. And as I said, and I know Mike and Arthur at Tea and Teaching Podcast have a speak pipe as well. It's an awesome little platform that you can head to on your laptop or on your phone and just submit a little audio clip straight to that podcast. So that's a great way to have to kind of contribute your thoughts about what can be done to spread the word of podcasting to as many educators, as many people as we know. It really does benefit everyone when there are more people involved. Now, we are just coming to the end of this podcast's typical runtime of about 30 minutes. Listeners, I know I do go over sometimes. I hope you don't switch off after 30 minutes. But, Arthur, we always end with one little question that looks to the future. And that question is, what's next for you? What's next for Arthur Moore?
What's next for Arthur Moore is also an excellent name for a podcast. Getting loads of ideas today. I'm really passionate about education. basically, Ludo. So I'm not really sure where that passion is going to take me. But basically, I like talking about education. So if I get any opportunities to talk about education, that's always awesome. I know I'm doing my first conference talk at the National Tutors Association this year. I've done some live pods for some educational conferences. That's kind of like, I'd really like to do more of that stuff because I like talking about education. Professionally, it's me really thinking about how I can kind of have a bigger impact upon the students I have, the students I'm going to work with in the future, but also the biggest sphere of education, which includes for me parents. I think parents we often miss out them as a really crucial link in the whole way a child is learning. So I'm also doing some parent workshops on how they can use cognitive science to have a big impact on their child's learning. So basically, what's next for Arthur? Hopefully more stuff to do with education.
There it is. You can find out more about Arthur, follow his journey on LinkedIn. You can head to moreedu.co.uk/T and teaching to find out more about the podcast, or you can find it on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, YouTube, everywhere. And their main channel is really Twitter. They do, as Arthur was just alluding to there, they do some live podcasts in Twitter Spaces, and a great channel and reel there. So head to Twitter and just type in T and Teaching. But Arthur, if they want to get in touch with you, listeners want to get in touch with you straight after this, what is the best way they can get in touch with you?
If you got me on LinkedIn, DM me. If not, arthur.moore@moreedu.co.uk. Just email me. I'm happy to chat. Just email me or get me on LinkedIn. And if you go on Twitter, T and Teaching, no offense to Mike, it's normally me. So if you DM us on T and Teaching at Twitter, it'll probably be me that responds.
Oh, look at that. Thank you so much, Arthur, for joining us here. Thank you, listeners, for checking in with the QT podcast once again. Next week, we will be speaking to Matt Green, who is otherwise known as the rapping science teacher, about his journey through music and education and growing his brand and growing his spreading of science knowledge and tips and tricks on learning science for students through his TikTok page and YouTube channel there. So that'll be a really good conversation with a wonderful guy in education, which we have also had today with Arthur Moore from T and Teaching. So Arthur, for one final time, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Ludo. Have an awesome day.
You too. Cheerio then. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Qualified Tutor Podcast. Whether you're a regular listener of this podcast or you've just stumbled across it, join the Qualified Tutor Podcast group within the Qualified Tutor community to stay up to date with our latest news, offers, workshops, and of course, simply to meet other tutors like you. Whatever your level as a tutor, our training courses will be the next step in your professional development. Visit qualifiedtutor.org/training to find out more about our CPD accredited and Ofqual recognised courses, the first of their kind in the tutoring industry. Your student deserves the best tutor possible. Make that happen today by joining Qualified Tutor.